You know, if there's one question I get asked more than any other, more even than do you think the government invented thunderstorms to cover up the sound of space battles, that question would have to be, Mark, is the Nikon AFD Nikon 28-105 f3.5 to 4.5 the ideal travel zoom for your manual film SLR, or does it compromise harder than the United Nations climate resolution? Well, today we're going to try and answer that question. The Nikon 28-105mm f3.5 to 4.5 lens is a compromise. Its focal range isn't particularly long, getting not quite short enough at the wide end and not quite long enough at the telephoto end, and it's not particularly bright, with a maximum aperture that shrinks down as you zoom into a rather tight f4.5. But it's a light lens, coming in at less than 500 grams and surprisingly small for its reach. For a bit of context, manual focus zooms for the Nikon F system, well, they kinda suck. If we chart our way back through the mist of cigarette smoke that is the 60s and 70s, well, you'll see that it's a rare thing for a lens to go as wide as 28mm, and the ones that do tap out at a very modest, middling standard length. 28 to 45mm just isn't exciting, and 1979's very peculiar 28 to 50mm is probably your best proof of the optical and physical limits of the technology at the time, with a small maximum f4 aperture despite the limited zoom range. One exception is probably, it's probably this Nikon 35 to 200mm f3.5 to 4.5s, as well as this Zoom Nikon 35 to 135mm f3.5 to 4.5 AIS. Both of these lenses are actually probably better than they have a right to be. But you know what? They still don't get wider than 35mm, and at 740 grams and 600 grams respectively, they could do with laying off the Tim Tams and taking up Pilates. It's only really when autofocus came in that we started to see some interesting and lighter products more suitable for taking with you on your summer holidays. This one, it came out in 1998. So while not a recent lens, it isn't really quite ready for the nursing home yet. It was around that time that Nikon was switching to their G lenses with no aperture ring, but an internal focus motor. This one mercifully still has that aperture ring, that nice clicky aperture ring, so it can be used on older manual film cameras. It also has a manual focus ring too, if you could call it a ring, more a narrow dial at the front of the lens. Like all AFD lenses, it needs a screw motor built into the body to drive the autofocus mechanism, and that's a problem when you're trying to use it on the cheaper, newer plastic film cameras of the era or adapted to the current Nikon Z system. It's versatile for the cameras that do support it and can still default to manual focus when you're using an older manual camera. A camera like this Nikon FG, one of Nikon's smallest and cutest film SLRs, even if it lacks the refinement of some of their higher-end models, and the mirror slaps louder than disciplining a red-headed stepchild. Yes, the Nikon FG is a bit of a diamond in the rough and probably deserves its own video at some point, but then so is this lens. While it's certainly not big, it's not very small. While usable as a manual focus film camera lens, it's not designed as such, and while it's not a heavy lens, you do still feel it around your neck. It is a lens of compromises, so perhaps the best test for it is to put it into the hands of a highly compromised photographer, specifically me, on one of my irregular forays to Colombo, Sri Lanka. As is usually the case, I was having to make the most out of a brief couple of hours of freedom, this time using it for a walk around Beera Lake in the city's centre. Now, if you are thinking that some of those colors seemed a bit pastely and perhaps even a couple of the images weren't as sharp as you'd expect, well, you can blame me for that, not the Nikon 28-105 f3.5 to 4.5 AFD. Fact is, I'd set the exposure compensation to plus 1.5, which is great for backlit portraits, but pretty much overexposed the roll. I did try to shorten the processing time a bit to compensate, and if you think that's bad, just wait until the second roll, because it took well into that for me to realize I was exposing all of my shots. That said, I do think you can get at least some sense of what this lens is capable of. Let's get the bad stuff out of the way first. This is not a lens to be used on a manual film camera. I mean, it works similarly to how it would work adapted to a mirrorless camera. But this wasn't a lens that was designed to be manually focused. Focusing with that tiny dial on the front is fiddly, and while you can get very precise using the focus assist tools of modern digital cameras, the focus throw is shorter than my bowling arm, and it makes it very hard to nail the exact focus point just relying on the split screen of the Nikon FG. Well, that's my excuse anyway. It did mean that in this photo, as an example, well, the focus is not as sharp as the beak of that malevolent-looking crow. Combining that with shooting the film at about ISO 75, and you end up with these fuzzy figments of potential images of unrealized ideas. Oh well, they seemed kinda nice too. It's a pity they're being relegated to the ghost brigade of near misses, but hey, not every picture is a keeper. My petty quibbles and technical self-handicapping aside though, and really this is a solid performer. As I've said, it's fairly light and the build quality, while mostly plastic, is still probably better than you'd expect compared to more modern glass. 28 to 105mm is a useful range in practice when I'm out in the streets. I find I don't need anything longer than 120mm or wider than 24. So this manages to find a comfortable place in there, if not spanning the full range. With 16 elements in 12 groups, this is quite a sophisticated design. It's clear they've gone to some effort to correct some of the issues inherent in making zoom lenses. It doesn't distort very heavily at all, with just a bit of barreling at 28mm and pincushioning at 105mm. It's not something I notice in the real world, and in that sense it's far better than some more recent and more expensive lenses I own that rely on software to correct them. This shows its film pedigree in that it also corrects quite well for chromatic aberration and vignetting, which, while not perfect, will allow you to get a pretty straight line off a negative without it looking too wobbly. It's just an all-round solid performer. It zooms via a zoom ring rather than the push-pull mechanism that was more common with the older zooms, and that's good and bad. The argument is that push-pull allows you to focus and zoom in one movement, but I think you'd need to be pretty familiar with the lens to anticipate exactly the length and rotation it needs to be while you're out composing. Honestly, I find the two-stage process of zooming then focusing does work best for me, and of course is not an issue if you're autofocusing anyway. Is it better as an autofocus rather than a manual focus lens? Well, yes, probably, but that's not what we're here to test today. Instead, glutton for punishment and still blindly shooting 1.5 stops overexposed, I put in a second roll, this time Kentmere 100 black and white. So 1.5 stops overexposure means I was rating it at what? ISO 35? Yeah, well, let's see how well this goes. So a final flurry of photos with the fuzzy Nikon zoom. Really, I should overexpose all my pictures because it's such a good test of my ability to do handheld photography. The final conclusion is that I failed the test. Pointing it at a distance and racking the telephoto out to 105mm and that f4.5 aperture made for a very shaky photo. Or photos. It did mean that I missed a couple of real opportunities, but I don't think we can blame the lens for that, since I'm the one who ignorantly pulled the film to ISO 35. So if all the images are soft, that's partly down to the shutter shake. Not completely though. There were a couple of moments where I missed focus. Now, that's a reasonable risk, snatching a decisive moment, but you can see here that even though I had plenty of time to focus, I still just missed on getting the sharpest photo of the sharpest footwear in the world. Crocs might be incisive gobblers of fauna and fauna, but this pair of plastic sandals, well, it suffered from a tiny bit of back focusing. I will lay the blame on that, on the inadequately short throw of the focus ring, as well as my own lack of attention blinking through the viewfinder of the FG and my own sweat as I tried to compose my shots. Obviously more of an issue for longer telephoto shots and macro, but still something to consider. Speaking of macro, that's one impressive feature of this lens. Well, it's really more of an afterthought probably. If you're in the 50 to 105mm zone depicted by the orange line on the zoom barrel, then you can flick the lens into macro mode to give you a 1:2 reproduction ratio. It's basically just an extension tube, and you do lose a bit of light that way, but it gives you an extra bit of intimacy to what is already quite a close focusing lens. To me, it's not a deal breaker or a maker. I'm just glad to have a fairly compact zoom lens to give me the versatility I need when traveling, despite the inevitable compromises. Picking 6 photos from the bunch, and these compromised captures are probably the strongest, not least because they're the ones that suffer least from the shakiness and blocked highlights of human handling and hubris. Let's keep this one for sure because there are a few interesting things in there, from the stop sign to the Lotus Tower, the decaying billboard, and the guy with the parasol. It's just a cool image. The other color ones were more of a struggle. I mean, how many shots of people walking along a roadside do you need? I do like the Castrol sign on this, but it does suffer from being a bit soft, so let's settle on this one, just because. And let's whittle down between these 2 commuter shots as well while we're at it, ending up with this one with the tracks in it because, well, casually hanging around 3 sets of train tracks isn't something that they'll let you do where I come from. The black and white photos suffered even more from the shakes. I do like the Sri Lankan buses, and the ethereal quality of this one is quite appealing until I remember that it's really just overexposed. But we have to have one in there, and this is a nice contrast with the minimalist lines of the building rising above it. And of course we have to have a tuk-tuk in there because what's a visit to Colombo without at least one white knuckle Uber ride to remind you of why your mum always told you to fasten your seatbelt. Finally, I can't pass by corrugations and variegations of roughly hewn humanity imposing itself in the world of nature. This one didn't make the video, and while I do like it, I ended up settling on this one because despite the weird composition, nature and artifice seem quite nicely balanced here. So you tell me if I've picked the best or if my many misadventures with this lens have soured my objectivity. As I said at the beginning, it's a compromise lens, but really the compromises are few compared to the lenses that preceded it, making an autofocus Nikon from the AFD era something to consider compared to its heavier manual ancestors. It still has that nice clicky aperture ring that makes it compatible across the range of Nikon F cameras, and that sadly Nikon did away with when they brought out their G lenses. And it does let you manually focus. Yes, the focus ring feels flimsy and it's hard to set precisely. The lens is also a bit heavy and a bit slow to make it a delight to use, but it did the job even here. I have one more overseas trip this year. Will I take it with me to Tokyo? Well, I'm probably going to still stick to my 35 to 200mm if I decide to go manual, and I do have an even lighter and cheaper lens with a longer focal length that I can bring with me for a more automatic experience. Time will tell, and no doubt I'll be telling all on this channel as I struggle with another piece of antiquated photography gear. Later.